The pre-dawn gloom of December 17, 1944, settled over the frozen Belgian landscape near Honsfeld, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the violence of the previous day. In the command turret of his Tiger II, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper listened to the death rattle of a 700-horsepower Maybach engine. It was a sound that signaled not mechanical failure, but logistical starvation. The engine sputtered, caught briefly, and then died, leaving only the ticking of cooling metal in the frigid air. Peiper, a man whose reputation was built on speed and ruthlessness, found himself paralyzed, not by enemy fire, but by a needle resting on zero. Around him, the vanguard of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the theoretical tip of Hitler's spear aimed at Antwerp, sat impotent. 67 heavy tanks, a technological terror capable of destroying anything the Allies could field, were reduced to 70-ton steel bunkers because the Third Reich could no longer feed them. The driver, under Weber, attempted to turn the engine over one last time, but the silence that followed was absolute. The reserve tanks were dry. The most feared armored unit in the German military was stationary, waiting for a miracle in the middle of a desperate offensive. Peiper descended from the steel hull of his tank, his boots breaking the crust of frozen mud that covered the road. The scene ahead of him in the mist-shrouded village of Honsfeld was surreal. The American 99th Infantry Division had retreated with such haste that the ghosts of their presence remained warm. Fires still crackled in oil drums used for heating. Half-eaten meals sat on field tables. Coffee steamed in metal cups, the vapor rising into the grey morning light. But it was not the food or the warmth that drew Peiper's gaze. It was the rows of olive-drab steel containers lined up with military precision. Thousands of jerry cans, stacked in pyramids that stretched for hundreds of meters, stood unguarded. It was a sight that bordered on the divine for a commander whose operational orders included the explicit instruction to scavenge for survival. His adjutant, Hauptsturmführer Hans Grull, pried open the cap of a canister, and the sharp, sweet chemical scent of high-octane gasoline cut through the smell of cordite and damp earth. It was aviation-grade fuel, mixed with high-quality motor gasoline, a volatile nectar that the fuel-starved engines of the German panzers craved. The mathematics of the discovery were staggering, almost incomprehensible to men who had spent years on the Eastern Front counting every liter. There were approximately 50,000 gallons of fuel sitting in this muddy field. It was enough to fill the bellies of every tiger and panther in Peiper's Kampfgruppe. It was enough to propel his column all the way to the Meuse River, potentially turning the tide of the entire Ardennes offensive. The Americans had abandoned more fuel in this single, secondary supply dump than entire German divisions had received in allocation for the past 6 months. Peiper walked among the stacks, watching his men frantically form bucket brigades, pouring the lifeblood of the American industrial machine into the thirsty German tanks. Yet, as he watched the fuel flow, a profound and terrible realization began to take hold. A cold dread, heavier than the winter air. If the American army could afford to leave 50,000 gallons of gasoline behind as a mere afterthought, if they could abandon such a strategic treasure without even bothering to destroy it, then the war was not merely going badly, it was structurally unwinnable. Germany was guarding liters while America was spilling oceans. To understand the depth of Peiper's despair at the moment of his greatest tactical windfall, one must look back at the strategic hallucination that was Operation Watch on the Rhine. 6 months prior to the miracle at Honsfeld, Albert Speer, the architect of the German war economy, had presented Adolf Hitler with a report that was essentially a death certificate for the Allied strategic bombing campaign had systematically dismantled the synthetic fuel industry that kept the German war machine moving. The great hydrogenation plants at Luna Plitz and Bleckhammer had been turned into twisted ruins. Luna, which had churned out 175,000 tons of fuel in April 1944, was reduced to a trickle of 5,000 tons by September. The statistics were a grim prophecy. In that same year, the United States was refining 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, scraping together every drop from synthetic plants and the dwindling Romanian fields, managed only 33 million barrels. The disparity was not tactical, it was existential. The combined Axis powers produced less than 2% of the petroleum that the United States generated alone. The Third Reich was attempting to fight a modern, mechanized war on a planetary scale with a fuel supply that would barely suffice for a regional conflict. The planning for the Ardennes offensive had been built upon a foundation of delusion. Major Friedrich Simon of the Wehrmacht's Logistics Command had done the math with German precision. To reach the strategic objective of Antwerp, the attacking forces would require 4.5 million gallons of fuel. Hitler, moving phantom armies on a map in his bunker, allocated 5 million gallons. It was a number that existed only on paper. In reality, due to a shattered rail network and a shortage of transport trucks, only half of that amount ever reached the staging areas. The High Command had devised a strategy born of desperation. The offensive would fuel itself. The plan explicitly relied on the capture of American supply dumps to maintain momentum. It was a strategy of piracy, betting the survival of the nation on the hope that the enemy would leave the keys in the ignition. Peiper, a veteran of the vast, pitiless steppes of Russia, knew that in modern warfare, logistics was the ultimate arbiter of victory. He had been told by General Sepp Dietrich that he would have enough fuel to reach the Meuse only if he captured American stocks. His initial allocation was 31,000 gallons, enough for 50 miles of combat maneuvering. The Meuse was 65 miles away. The plan was not a military operation. It was a suicide pact with mathematics. As the offensive launched on December 16th, the disparity between the two combatants was illustrated not by gunfire, but by the flow of liquids. On the American side of the lines, mere miles from where Peiper's tanks were revving their engines, Captain James Rose of the 743rd Tank Battalion recorded a mundane entry in his logbook about receiving an 8,000-gallon resupply, noting with irritation that his storage tanks were already full. Across the line, Peiper issued draconian orders to conserve every drop. Engines were to be cut during any halt lasting longer than 5 minutes. The massive Tiger I is consuming gallons to the mile, were forced to drive in single file to minimize friction and consumption, turning the spearhead into a sluggish, vulnerable snake. The artillery barrage that announced the offensive was a thunderous display of firepower, expending more ammunition in hours than had been used in previous campaigns, but it masked a hollow core. The German beast had teeth, but it had no blood. The friction of war began to erode the German timeline immediately. The roads of the Ardennes, marked as highways on German staff maps, were little more than narrow, winding country lanes, totally unsuited for the width and weight of the King Tigers. Traffic jams of nightmarish proportions developed within hours. Vehicles designed for the open plains of Ukraine tore up the fragile Belgian pavement, bogging down in mud and snow. At Lanzarote, a single American intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, 18 men dug into a ridge, held up Peiper's entire column for nearly 10 hours. During those lost hours, hundreds of German vehicles sat idling, their engines burning precious fuel while going nowhere. By the time they finally broke through and reached Honsfeld at dawn on the 17th, the column had covered only 20 miles but had consumed 40% of their initial fuel load. The terrifying efficiency of the Tiger tank's consumption rate, 2.5 gallons per mile. Off-road was bleeding the operation dry. The capture of the Honsfeld depot was not just a success, it was a stay of execution. The discoveries made by Peiper's men at Honsfeld went beyond the mere physical presence of gasoline. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann, a soldier with a background in import logistics, found shipping manifests in the depot's office that told a story of logistical omnipotence. The paperwork traced the journey of the fuel from the refineries of Texas to the ports of New York, across the dangerous expanse of the Atlantic to Liverpool, across the English Channel to Normandy, and finally, via truck convoy, to this muddy field in Belgium. It was a supply chain spanning 6,000 miles, operating with a speed and volume that Germany could not replicate even within its own borders. Hoffmann showed the papers to Peiper. The commander read them, crumpled them in his gloved hand, and stood silent. The implication was clear. The enemy was not just fighting with soldiers. They were fighting with a global industrial conveyor belt that could deliver high-octane aviation fuel to a frontline infantry division as easily as delivering mail. Private Ernst Carr found copies of the Stars and Stripes newspaper, barely 2 days old, boasting of a new pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, delivering 300,000 gallons a day. A single Allied pipeline was moving more fuel every 24 hours than Peiper's entire battle group would use in the entirety of the operation.
Fueled by the American bounty, the German column surged forward, reaching Boulogne by noon. They captured more supplies, including maps that revealed the location of other American fuel depots. The maps were a revelation of abundance. Every major crossroad seemed to house a stockpile. The U.S. First Army held reserves of 3.5 million gallons. To the starving Germans, the map looked like a menu of a feast they could never finish. Peiper pushed on toward Lignaville and then toward Stavelot, the site of a massive depot containing over 2 million gallons of gasoline. This was the prize that would guarantee the success of the drive to Antwerp. But the Americans were beginning to react, not just with tanks and infantry, but with the weapon of denial. At Stavelot, Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion received orders to burn the fuel rather than let it fall into German hands. As Peiper's vanguard approached the town, they saw a pillar of black smoke rising thousands of feet into the sky, a dark monument to American wealth. The scene at Stavelot on the evening of December 17 was a vision of hell that broke the spirit of the German attackers more effectively than any artillery barrage. Technical Sergeant Paul Solis had ignited a wall of fire using gasoline trails and white phosphorus grenades. The depot, containing over 2 million gallons of fuel packed in jerry cans across 15 acres, erupted. The heat was intense enough to melt glass. The roar of the flames drowned out the sound of tank engines. Peiper watched from his turret as the fuel that could have powered his division to the sea was consumed in an act of casual destruction. Unterscharfer Weber later recounted that Peiper stared at the inferno for 5 minutes before climbing down and muttering a question that haunted the rest of the campaign: "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons to deny them to us. What are we doing here?" It was the moment the tactical reality collided with the strategic impossibility. The Americans treated millions of gallons of gasoline as expendable ammunition, while the Germans treated individual liters as holy relics. Across the entire front, the story was the same. At Troisponts, another 1.1 million gallons were torched. At Spa, 2.5 million gallons were destroyed. In the first week of the battle, American engineers destroyed over 8 million gallons of fuel. This quantity was greater than the total fuel allocation for the entire German offensive. The Americans were burning more gasoline as a defensive measure than Germany had been able to scrape together for its greatest attack of the year. This scorched earth policy was made possible by the Red Ball Express and the Pluto pipeline system. The Red Ball Express, a relentless conveyor belt of trucks, was delivering 12,500 tons of supplies to the front every single day. The trucks alone consumed more fuel in their operations than Army Group B received in a month. It was a system of redundancy and excess. By December 1944, Allied forces were consuming 1.2 million gallons a day and receiving 1.4 million. They were building a surplus in the middle of a high-intensity conflict. The Germans were fighting against a force that grew stronger the more it expended resources. The psychological impact of this logistics gap began to rot the German morale from the inside out. Peiper's radio intercepts, deciphered by American intelligence, revealed a force on the brink of collapse. Enemy critically short of fuel, General Courtney Hodges noted, ordering the destruction of any stocks threatened by capture. Meanwhile, in the skies above the besieged town of Bastogne, American C-47 transport planes were flying hundreds of sorties to drop supplies to the surrounded 101st Airborne. On a single day, they dropped 160,000 gallons of fuel to a single division, an amount that exceeded what Peiper possessed for his entire corps. The German soldiers, marching through the snow past abandoned American trucks that had been left with their engines running to keep the cabs warm, were struck by a sense of profound futility. German prisoners of war, upon being captured, often expressed more shock at the American waste than at American firepower. Seeing a GI throw away a half-eaten chocolate bar or use gasoline to heat a pot of coffee shattered the myth of the soft American. It demonstrated a wealth so vast it rendered the German concept of sacrifice meaningless. By December 19, Peiper was engaged at Stoumont, but his war had become a battle against the fuel gauge. He was forced to abandon tanks not because they were damaged, but because they were dry. He consolidated the remaining fuel from the abandoned vehicles, siphoning it into the few Tigers and Panthers still running. He had perhaps 8,000 gallons left, enough for one fight or one retreat, but not both. While Peiper counted liters, Allied planners were rubber-stamping a request for 245 million gallons for January operations without a second thought. The disparity in equipment quality further compounded the issue. The American Sherman tank, often derided for its thin armor, was a marvel of automotive efficiency, sipping fuel at 0.8 gallons per mile compared to the Tiger's voracious thirst. American trucks were standardized, reliable, and backed by a supply chain of interchangeable parts. The German column was a traveling museum of captured French, Russian, and Italian vehicles, each requiring different fluids and spare parts, a logistical nightmare that collapsed under stress. On December 20th, the final nail was driven into the coffin of Kampfgruppe Peiper. A radio message arrived confirming that a resupply convoy had been obliterated by Allied air power. There would be no more fuel. Sturmbannführer Pochki delivered the news. They had range for 20 kilometers. The Meuse was 30 kilometers away. Peiper gathered his officers and articulated the grim truth that had started at Honsfeld. They were fighting an enemy who burned more fuel to spite them than Germany had produced for the entire operation. The victory at Honsfeld, which had felt like a miracle, was nothing to the Americans, a rounding error in their daily consumption. General Otto von Manschufel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, echoed this sentiment in his post-war writings, noting that the knowledge of the 8 million gallons destroyed by the Americans was the moment he knew the offensive was dead. It was a war of logistics, and Germany had brought a knife to a gunfight. By December 21st, Peiper was surrounded at La Gleize. His force was immobile. The American units encircling him, the 30th Infantry, the 82nd Airborne, the 3rd Armored, had a combined daily fuel allocation of 340,000 gallons. Peiper had less than 1,000. Inside the perimeter, the situation was medieval. Outside, the American industrial machine was flexing its muscles. General Patton's Third Army was executing a 90-degree pivot to drive north, a maneuver that required 350,000 gallons of fuel just to execute, a logistical feat considered impossible by German standards yet accomplished by the Americans in 3 days. When the weather cleared on December 23, the sky filled with Allied aircraft. P-47 Thunderbolts and B-26 Marauders flew thousands of sorties, burning aviation fuel at a rate that would have grounded the entire Luftwaffe for weeks. The air power alone consumed more resources in a day than the German ground offensive used in its entirety. On the night of December 23, the end came. Peiper ordered the abandonment of his vehicles. Of the 119 tanks and assault guns that had begun the charge, 39 remained operational but sat silent and cold, their fuel tanks empty. The men drained the last dregs of gasoline to set charges, destroying their own equipment. Millions of Reichsmarks of cutting-edge technology were detonated because they lacked the liquid to move them. Peiper and 800 men escaped on foot through the snow, leaving behind the iron carcasses of the Reich's ambitions. They had advanced 60 miles, won tactical victories, and terrified the American rear echelon, only to be defeated by the simple reality of supply. The trek back to German lines was a death march of illusions. Every step through the snow reinforced the total failure of the German worldview. They had believed that will, courage, and racial superiority could overcome material disadvantage. The empty tanks at La Gleize proved them wrong. The news of the logistical disparity filtered up to the highest levels of the German command, where it was met with denial. When Field Marshal Walter Model was presented with the reports of the captured and destroyed fuel stocks, he remarked, "We are not fighting the same war." Hitler, insulated in his bunker, dismissed the figures as propaganda, claiming the photos of burning Stavelot were Hollywood trickery. But the common soldier knew. The letters home, despite heavy censorship, carried the virus of defeatism. Soldiers wrote of Americans washing clothes in gasoline, of artillery fired to celebrate Christmas, of a material abundance that felt like fighting against infinity. The German propaganda machine had painted the Americans as a mongrel race incapable of endurance, but the soldiers on the ground saw a nation that could pave the road to victory with supplies. The failure in the Ardennes was the final verdict on industrial warfare. By 1944, the production ratios were insurmountable. The Allied two-axis production advantage in key categories was 5-1, in petroleum, it was 50-1. No amount of tactical brilliance or individual heroism could bridge that gap. The United States built 88,000 tanks to Germany's 46,000. It refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil to Germany's 33 million. The war had ceased to be a contest of strategy and had become a contest of production management. Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld, that 50,000 gallons was a treasure to him and trash to the Americans, encapsulated the entire conflict. The Battle of the Bulge consumed the Wehrmacht's last reserves of men and machines, but more importantly, it destroyed the last reserves of hope. Decades later, the physical remnants of this logistical defeat still stand. In the village of L'Église, a King Tiger tank remains on display. It sits exactly where it was abandoned on that December night, its 88mm cannon pointing toward a horizon it could never reach. Visitors often ask why such a formidable machine, with its thick armor and powerful gun, was left behind intact. The answer is banal and devastating: it ran out of gas. In 1984, veterans from both sides met at the site. A former German tank commander stood with an American sergeant who had fought to contain him. The American admitted they never realized how short of fuel the Germans were, because the Americans had so much they simply never thought about it. The German replied that they stopped because they were empty, and the knowledge that the Americans burned millions of gallons to deny them was a psychological blow they could not recover from. The story of Joachim Peiper at Honsfeld is not ultimately a story about a battle. It is a story about the collision of two realities. One reality was based on the romantic Prussian ideal of the warrior, where grit and maneuver could conquer all. The other reality was the American way of war, a corporate, industrial juggernaut that viewed logistics as the primary weapon. When Peiper watched his men pouring American gasoline into German tanks, he was witnessing the death of the old way of war. The 50,000 gallons he captured represented 0.6% of the daily American supply. It was a drop in the bucket. The German army didn't lose the Battle of the Bulge because they forgot how to fight. They lost because they were fighting an adversary who could afford to waste more than Germany could produce. The war was over the moment the first American jerrycan was poured into a Tiger tank, proving that the Third Reich was no longer a superpower, but a scavenger picking through the leftovers of a true industrial giant.